Hello and welcome to Macro Matters, the economics and politics podcast from Aberdeen Standard Investments. My name is Paul Diggle, Senior Economist at Aberdeen Standard, and along with my co-host Stephanie Kelly, we're guiding you through the macroeconomic and political themes which are driving global markets. Today we're talking about the politics of vaccines. Are we seeing a rise in vaccine nationalism as countries compete for limited supplies? How and when will the world's poorest countries gain access to vaccines? And could countries use vaccines as a tool of foreign policy and soft power and influence by engaging in vaccine diplomacy? Before we get into the topic, let's hear from UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson talking about the UK-EU spat over access to vaccines.
You'll have seen all this stuff in the papers about, our friends across the channel and disputes with them and all that kind of thing. All I would say is whatever the toings and froings there, we're very confident in our security of supply. We will continue to take steps to protect the UK's security of supply and also to ensure that we ramp up our own manufacturing. The UK we can't think of this as just a project for us and us alone. One of the things about the Oxford vaccine, the most important thing about the Oxford vaccine is it obviously can be distributed at room temperature, which is great, but it's also being distributed at cost and around the world. And we want to make sure that as many people across the whole of the world, across Europe, across the whole world, get access to vaccines.
That was Boris Johnson, and joining me to talk about vaccine geopolitics are Stephanie Kelly, co-host of the podcast and our senior political economist, and Robert Gilhooly, our senior emerging market economist. So Steph, let's start with the events of the past week between the UK and the EU. In the first part of that clip there, we heard Boris Johnson talking about securing the UK's vaccine supply. And of course, the EU has been concerned about its own supply, going so far as to briefly propose quite controversial diplomatic measures to ensure its supply. And this spat is an early example of what's being called vaccine nationalism. So why don't we sort of run through the background of the recent events between the UK and the EU, what's happened and why?
Sure. So it's kind of complicated. It's been a confluence of bad news, I think, particularly for the European Commission and the European Union more broadly. It's been a challenging few weeks. So the context to all of this is that the UK's own health regulator approved the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca vaccine earlier than the Europeans. And what that did was meant that naturally vaccine distribution was more quick. Additional to that, the UK has the benefit of just being one single country with relatively limited geography. It's not to say that rollout's been perfect by any means, but in some ways it's gone through the initial couple of weeks of teething and you're starting to see a little bit more kind of consistency in UK vaccination. You compare that to where the EU is and indeed was last week, and the realities of just trying to go through this in a kind of combined way have started to put strain on countries' relations within the EU. So specifically, the European Medical Agency, the European Health Regulator, was trying to move through the vaccine approval process, but it is a slower process than under the UK. In addition to that, there were Pfizer production delays that were particularly affecting European countries, which meant that European stocks of vaccines were very low. Last week, we were seeing headlines that, vaccines were basically stopping in key cities across Europe because they just didn't have the vaccine stock at the time. And they hadn't yet approved the AstraZeneca vaccine. Then what happened was AstraZeneca came to the EU and basically said, we're not going to be able to fulfill the extent of the vaccine orders that you've asked for. I think they were saying they could produce something along the lines of like a quarter to a half of what had been promised for the early stages of 2021. this obviously was met with quite a lot of negativity from the European Union, unusually before it had even been approved. And at the same time as the German authorities were suggesting it shouldn't even be approved for over 65s. So it was a weird week. So I mean, there was a confluence of a lot of tensions. But I think what you saw was particularly the European Commission kind of coming out and, to a degree, pointing to the AstraZeneca issues as a source of risk to vaccine supply, when in many ways, actually, the Pfizer vaccine, for example, was also, it's kind of had stock problems there. So I think it was a lot of bad news, and AstraZeneca became the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, or the kind of primary way in which all this kind of tension was articulated, which I think is what brought us to what was quite a noisy Friday when it came to this kind of stuff.
So a complicated set of events, but it has in a way crystallized. It's been the first crystallization of vaccine nationalism and countries competing for what is currently a limited supply of vaccines. The role of the Commission is interesting there, as you highlighted, because it was the group within the EU that did the centralized ordering, and which arguably slowed down the eventual delivery of vaccines to the EU. But perhaps the Commission's defense is that it did the centralized ordering precisely to prevent squabbling over a limited supply of vaccines, and to use its large-scale bargaining power to secure vaccines for the EU. But obviously, in this case, that's kind of backfired. So a few obvious questions sort of flow from this, and the most obvious one, which I'm going to ask you, is, of course, what does it say about Brexit? Is there any read across for the Brexit? I mean, I have noticed that the UK government themselves have not explicitly trumpeted this as that's why Brexit happened and it was a good idea. They haven't gone to that level of simplicity and simplifying it down. But I'm sure, there are some maybe backbench MPs who have gone that far. But do we think there is any read across here for Brexit?
I mean, I think the Brexit context is really important, just because, I mean, bear in mind, particularly, we talked about this a lot in our Brexit kind of editions of this podcast, that, for the EU, a big part of their negotiating style and their objectives in the Brexit negotiations was to disincentivize states wanting to not be in the EU, right? They didn't want it to look like it was super easy and positive to leave the European Union. I think this is probably the first case where there is an argument that there's just, as I mentioned earlier, it is slightly easier to distribute vaccines within one country, one kind of domestic setting. Again, the UK is kind of special in the sense that it is relatively small as well, like geographically. So there are benefits the UK has that I think would have applied in either case. But the reality is that the decision was made to take an EU centralized approach. And that decision may well play out to be quite positive. It may pay off in the medium term. But what we're seeing is that the EU is at a much earlier stage of kind of rollout, and individual countries are having their own individual issues. I think the realities will become clearer over time that, yes, part of this is because the European Commission moved a little bit slower in terms of getting kind of the vaccine, or at least the health regulators moved a little bit slower in terms of approving vaccines. I mean, the AstraZeneca vaccine was just approved, I think, over the weekend. So there is a little bit of that, but there's also the fact that you just got, many, many different countries with many different health systems and many different challenges. And I think that will kind of naturally create more issues. So I'm not sure it's entirely kind of a Brexit dividend or not. I think the reality is you're trying to coordinate a much, much bigger group of countries with very different challenges at a time when they're also just a little bit behind because they did move more slowly. Don't forget, before Christmas, the UK regulator was actually kind of criticized in European newspapers for moving too quickly to approve vaccines before any other country. And now we're kind of seeing the flip side of that argument play out.
Yeah, I think one other sort of important technical point to make is that the specific legislation under which the UK approved the vaccines wasn't something that the UK regained with Brexit. So It was done during the transition. So when the usual rules of the EU essentially applied to the UK, but it was able to be applied anyway. So this was an ability that always existed. but perhaps you could say there was a greater political willingness to use that independent approval route in the context of Brexit. So, I mean, another way in which this interacts with Brexit and this issue of vaccine nationalism is important is if the EU's slow start, and as you say, maybe it gets off to a much stronger pace of vaccines later on. But if this slow start is a potential source of Euroscepticism or internal criticism of the Commission from within Europe, are we seeing any signs of that?
Yeah, we're definitely starting to see signs of that from within individual countries. Again, I mean, we see this a lot with Euroscepticism and Europhobia. You know, the points I just tried to make is, yes, there are failings at the European Commission level, but also there are individual country issues. But naturally, the European Union is a useful scapegoat in general, but particularly, you know, for politicians who already are Eurosceptic or Europhobic in inclination, and for voters who, you know, have had a really tough year and are, you know, struggling to get access to the vaccine. I think stories that the European Commission is being slow, or the health regulator is not moving quickly enough, or I think all of those things aren't going to help. So at the margin, I do think this is the kind of thing you're already starting to see dissatisfaction and kind of media coverage of people feeling like being a member of the European Union right now doesn't feel as beneficial because there's a perception that maybe it could have been done better kind of independently. To your point, technically things could have been done independently. It was a choice to kind of take this aggregated route. My uncertainty is just how long it lasts, because if these are just teething problems, you know, as vaccines get approved, as supply chains kind of get the niggles at the beginning of a supply chain get worked out, does this become kind of a short period of time in which, yes, we see the tensions? Or do you continue to see this kind of build and build? And are there further missteps by the European Commission in terms of making sure that the vaccine rollout is as effective, as efficient, and as complete as it possibly can be?
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose one other sort of important point in the context of this UK-EU spat is that it highlights vaccine production as an important strategic industry or part of a potential future industrial strategy, ensuring you have the domestic capacity to produce vaccines. And that's different to what we traditionally thought of as the strategic industries that governments wanted to protect. So I wonder if that's something that EU and other governments will think more about. But moving on then, so the sort of second point we want to cover in this theme of vaccine politics is, as vaccine rollout increases in some countries and they get close to sort of herd immunity levels of vaccine coverage within their country, the concern about importing mutations and strains from elsewhere, which there is a risk that they then render vaccines ineffective, that concern becomes more and more pressing. And the thought is that potentially this means lockdown reopening occurs in some countries internally, but the external restrictions, barriers to entry and movement across borders, is a much more longer lasting lockdown restriction. This is an artifact of differential rates of vaccine and now the emergence of new strains. And Steph, do we believe that story? Are external movements and movements in and out of a country one of the lockdown restrictions that are going to last well beyond a country actually having high levels of vaccine coverage?
I think absolutely it will, or at least I strongly believe that this will be kind of the last kind of step in the reopening process that takes place. And there might be quite a gap between when economies reopen in many ways domestically versus when you can go on another international holiday. I should say, I actually just cancelled an international holiday for the summertime. So I'm kind of putting my money where my mouth is. And I think that's something that we should kind of be factoring in. Now, obviously, Paul, we've talked a lot about the issue of kind of mutations. And at the moment, the big fear is importing a mutation. But what we're seeing, in UK headlines in the last couple of days is that mutations that happen within a country, they can't be helped by having these travel restrictions. So maybe it becomes harder for, people for example, in the UK, where the mutation appears to be looking more like the South African variant, which we know is more resistant to vaccines, that might be a world in which, the solution is not, well, just make it harder to travel because it's in the country and it's kind of been bred in the country. And so long as COVID is allowed to exist to a degree in economies, then those travel restrictions only get you so far. Nonetheless, it really seems like at the moment, the big fear is importing the existing mutations. And then maybe as time goes on, if more mutations come through, policy just has to turn again.
Yeah. So Bob, bringing you in then. So the potential for even more border controls and freedom of movement across countries being one of, as Steph says, one of the longest lived restrictions, and with obvious knock-on implications for tourism and travel, including Steph's summer holiday plans. That has implications for a lot of EMs, right? Because, or at least a subset of emerging markets, because they are quite reliant on tourism flows as one of their sources of economic activity. How are you thinking about that in an emerging market context?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. As kind of Steph was saying, for a little while there had actually been some talk about kind of opening up of more travel corridors within Asia, but I think kind of signs that barriers are really being lowered seems to have kind of gone, partly reflecting concerns around viral mutations. Paul, as you said, it's really a kind of subset of emerging markets that this is a really big issue for. So Thailand is the one that really stands out. Its tourism balance is around 10% of GDP, but there's quite a few other EMs that also run substantial tourism surpluses, so they're very much hurting at the moment. Turkey, Hungary, and Egypt all have surpluses around about 4%, whereas China, Russia, Philippines, and Brazil are quote unquote benefiting to the tune of about 1% of GDP. But clearly, this kind of isn't the whole picture. And I think here it kind of flags that EMs can also be suffering more from a longer duration shock. It's okay for some tourism businesses to kind of tough it out when there's a kind of light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. But as Steph was kind of flagging there, I think that is can be called into question. And of course, as well, I think maybe one other point to bring up, it's not just about tourism. Universities in Australia and the UK have clearly benefited from foreign students coming to study. And that has also been a route for firms to kind of tap a larger pool of talent as well when recruiting. So there's kind of more to it than just tourism when you're kind of stopping the flow of people across borders.
Yeah, this is a huge issue for globalization itself. If as we all expect, one of the long-lived consequences of the virus is not that globalization reverses, nothing as simple as that, but that the flow of people across borders is quite plausibly one of the aspects of globalization which is hit in the long term as a result of the virus. Okay, well, so we've sort of been talking about vaccine nationalism, both in the context of the UK EU spat and in terms of controlling borders, but we also want to get into this topic of vaccine diplomacy as the other angle in which there's geopolitical implications of vaccine rollout. And this is the idea that countries could use vaccine donations or sharing excess supply or funding vaccine rollout programs more straightforwardly as a tool, as an economic tool, a humanitarian tool, but also as a tool of foreign policy, strategic influence, soft power. And one can easily imagine that the US, the EU, the UK, China have strong strategic incentives to engage in vaccine diplomacy. So Steph, I think this is a very new topic. I mean, are we seeing much in the way of vaccine diplomacy at the moment? I suspect it's still quite early days, but do we think it is a plausible tool of foreign policy?
Yeah, I think it certainly will be increasingly, and you're already seeing kind of the early stages of it. I think when I was trying to think about this issue of vaccine diplomacy, I think it's useful to categorize it into kind of vaccine diplomacy as signaling, as a security measure and as a strategic influence measure. And I think, the signaling is kind of the fact that the UK and Europe and now the US under President Biden are all keen to signal through, for example, participation in COVAX, the World Health Organization kind of sponsored vaccine sharing system, is kind of an opportunity to say like, hey, I am a positive actor in the global multilateral environment, particularly for Biden. We've talked about that on other episodes of this podcast. He wants the US to be part of multilateral rules-based organizations. And this is an opportunity to signal that, yes, we are a country that does that. I think then there's a security component. And I don't mean security from the sense of kind of militarily, I mean security from COVID. And, to a degree, you could say we're already seeing Australia providing support to emerging markets in Asia, who are obviously geographically quite close, and there are relatively close relationships there. There may be a degree of kind of securing your kind of local kind of region. And again, maybe that goes to the regionalization component of globalization that we've talked about. And then finally, it's the strategic influence. And this is where I think the interesting discussion becomes, which is for countries like China or, the US, these two major powers, do they utilize vaccine kind of redistribution or financial support to fund vaccines? Do they use those to try and influence key regions? And in particular, I mean, my big question, Bob, is around how China is likely to utilize this and to act to try and shore up support, maybe in Asia, but also, in Africa, maybe, where we've seen a lot of investment by China.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And this kind of vaccine diplomacy versus nationalism seems to be proceeding at a slightly kind of different pace, if you will. So China seems to be engaging in kind of this diplomacy alongside trying to kind of vaccinate its own population, whereas maybe we think that some of the vaccine diplomacy from other advanced economies is really going to kind of lag or be a result and after they've done their own vaccine nationalism. So I guess for China, this is engaging in this kind of diplomatic push alongside their own vaccination efforts is probably arguably put it in a slightly stronger diplomatic position. We've not seen thus far kind of overt signs of kind of tying vaccines to kind of specific aims, but it's certainly kind of one that is improving their soft power and their reach, particularly in Africa, but across Asia and also Latin America too. I mean, for China, it's quite interesting. It's certainly not a costless strategy, and China has been able to do this partly because its vaccines been its virus case numbers have been so well under control. But as we've seen in Q1, having to put in kind of heavy-handed, quite targeted restrictions ahead of Lunar New Year may cause Q1 growth to dip. So there is a difficulty here of kind of trying to still manage your own domestic economy at the same time. But ultimately, if China can be seen to be kind of a bit more of the solution rather than the cause of the pandemic, I'm sure they're going to take that as a big win diplomatically.
Yeah, and that's crucial, isn't it, Bob? Because China has already, in a way, been engaged in a form of COVID diplomacy pre-vaccines, both in arguably playing down the origins of the virus, but also, importantly, highlighting the policymakers' success in containing the virus, with the implication that this is telling you something important about the effectiveness of the Chinese political system and organization. And my read is that the implication or the soft power influence of that is, well, maybe our form of political organization and government and the way we run the country has significant advantages for, say, African country looking at the Western model versus a Chinese model. Is that a fair characterization of how China's been acting up to now? And then further to that, it's quite plausible then to sort of imagine vaccines flowing along the Silk Road or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's very plausible, and it's worth, of course, kind of stating the obvious, China's a massive country, and that sort of political narrative domestically has, I think, definitely strengthened the Chinese Communist Party's hand. So they could argue, we came out of the global financial crisis better, kind of Western-made financial crisis. Now we've had this horrible COVID kind of come out of nowhere, and we've shown that China could be first out of this shock with its kind of the deftness of the Chinese Communist Party. So yeah, I think that is a fair characterization. It's harder to know, I guess, whether other countries, whether this will kind of do more than kind of change their opinion of China, and to the extent that it will really influence kind of domestic politics per se in kind of other emerging markets. That's maybe a kind of a step too far, but certainly one to kind of be aware of, that kind of risk of creeping authoritarianism across emerging markets.
And Steph, that framework you put in place about the reasons why a country might engage in vaccine diplomacy, it variously being it's just the right thing to do. It's a tool of soft power and influence. It's part of engaging in the rules-based system, and it's in a country's own economic and healthcare self-interest anyway. That's a super useful framework. A few points. I mean, one is to obviously remind listeners that the US under Trump was not involved in COVAX because that was a WHO-led program, and the US obviously under Trump pulled out of the WHO. So there's interesting ways in which it intersects with the new tone and tenor that Biden's trying to bring to the US's role in the world. I
do wonder on that. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about what Bob was saying. I think that the point about simultaneously being focused on, vaccine rollout within China, but also having this kind of strategic eye on how can we kind of, support other countries. And I do think that kind of the strategic reliance on China builds in this way, just because, in addition to all the other ways in which those kind of emerging markets kind of are increasingly reliant on China. And I do wonder, although under Biden, he is clearly keen to signal kind of a political commitment to rules-based multilateralism. I'm certain the US will be an important, contributor to the COVAX program, all of this. But I think the reality is that will he go far enough to say that the US is now going to take the kinds of steps kind of bilaterally that China is taking in terms of, actively encouraging emerging markets, actively contributing to either financially or vaccine stocks of emerging markets directly? I'd actually struggle to see that. And I do wonder if maybe developed markets are so focused on fighting the fires internally that they miss the strategic opportunities. And maybe in 10 years' time, do we look back and say, that was a moment where China's reach really expanded in a way that, was somewhat unexpected. And it was because developed markets were so focused inward and so focused on their regional concerns that they weren't thinking strategically about the relative balance of power, in this kind of geopolitical way.
So that leads us really nicely, I think, onto our sort of fourth point that we want to get into, which is when do EMs get the vaccine, and what does it mean for their economic outlook and for financial markets, which I think have on the whole embraced a theme of global reopening being very supportive for emerging market stocks as a sort of risk-on pro-cyclical bet on the global recovery. Does the fact that a lot of EMs outside of China, maybe India and Russia, are going to be much later to roll out vaccines sort of cross-cut against that narrative? So maybe, Bob, the starting question is just, when are we thinking a lot of the emerging markets other than the BRIC economies get the vaccine? And what does that actually mean for the trajectory of their recovery from coronavirus?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, it certainly varies, I think, a lot across the emerging market landscape, particularly, outside those kind of big BRIC economies. So, for example, Chile is one of the few, I think, emerging markets in Latin America to have kind of conclusively secured enough doses to inoculate their entire population. So, they may be kind of a bit more at the forefront alongside a country like Russia. You might be talking more kind of like the end of this year for having vaccinated a significant proportion of their population, though. For other kind of the other major emerging markets, it's a difficult call. We think we're talking more like the sort of second half of 2022 to achieve kind of vaccination that's really kind of high enough to be fairly confident about herd immunity. And also I'm talking about the kind of major, relatively large emerging markets. The lower income emerging markets in particular, we think are going to be lagging well behind even this timescale. As I was discussing earlier on, as kind of EU has shown, it can be quite hard to judge timelines for vaccines, even when you've got agreements in place, and many EMs are just simply not secured enough doses, even if kind of things are broadly heading in the right direction. So I think that raises kind of two key points for emerging markets. First of all, emerging markets are clearly suffering a much longer duration shock than developed markets. This makes it harder to continue to kind of provide kind of optimal policy support over such a long period of time, thereby potentially prolonging some of the long-term economic damage. And then kind of secondly, there's a question about kind of how strong is the impulse from developed markets as they recover over to emerging markets. So in particular, if developed markets, such as the US, UK, are recovering with a vaccinated population, a good chunk of their economic activity may be skewed towards services rather than goods, thereby the kind of impulse, if you will, to emerging markets via the normal goods channel could be proving a little bit elusive. So, that gap between DM timelines and EM timelines is important, I'd say.
Is the fact that EMs are just much younger and have a far more favorable demographic structure in the context, obviously, of a virus which is extremely discriminating as you move up the age range and becomes much worse, something which makes differential speeds of vaccine rollout less significant? I mean,
yeah, I think the jury's still out a little bit on this one. This was an argument we had actually at the very onset of the COVID shock. How will emerging markets cope? Will their younger demographics really provide them with much protection? I don't think it's really turned out to be the case that has proved to be kind of provide them with sufficient protection. There could, of course, be a point that we just kind of haven't reached that turning point. So, for example, when you combine a slightly younger population with the fact that some estimates out there put EM populations such as Mexico, who may have already had a significant proportion of their population already had COVID, then you could potentially get to a point where the kind of virus dies down a little bit more quickly, or it's kind of, I guess, the costs of it are lower because you have fewer kind of people within the hospitals. But I think we're still a long way from that point. So to me, that feels like quite a weak argument. I think as well, when you think about this in terms of kind of your vaccination program, well, it'd be great if you could target that proportion of your population that hasn't already had COVID. But I think for most emerging markets or even advanced economies, there's just no way of doing that. So that again means your kind of timeline to hitting herd immunity is probably still quite far out. So I guess I'm quite cautious on that point as to whether it will prove to be beneficial in the long run.
Yeah. So, Steph, perhaps a final question on this topic area of the rollout of vaccines to emerging markets is whether certain vaccines over time seem to become the EM vaccines and some vaccines become the DM vaccines. And you can imagine that dividing rather cynically along costs and efficacy lines. Is that a development that we are expecting to happen or already see underway?
Yeah, I think I would say that's kind of my base case for how things ultimately play. I mean, maybe in the short term, because there are a limited number of vaccines, maybe there's more of a kind of just a distribution of kind of randomness in terms of which ones get distributed. But it's important to bear in mind that if we compare the mRNA vaccine, so like the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, they not only are they more expensive. I mean, the Pfizer vaccine, I think, is the most expensive per dose, but they have to be more than refrigerated. They have to be kept at extremely low temperatures that aren't straightforward for particularly emerging markets, less developed countries to have kind of storage. I mean, even within developed market contexts, it has limited the ability to roll out vaccines really quickly, just because it's kind of such an extreme low temperature that's required. So not only do you have the cost element being higher for these more effective vaccines, they're also much more difficult to transport and to store in a less developed context. And I think that's ultimately what's going to drive longer term, lower efficacy vaccines being utilized more in in emerging markets. So the AstraZeneca vaccine is a prime candidate long term to be an emerging market vaccine, unless obviously, unless its efficacy turns out to be kind of on the higher end of those initial estimates, right? So we're all assuming the AstraZeneca vaccine efficacy is lower, but if it turns out that they find a dosage that ends up bringing it up to 90%, then maybe that distribution, you don't end up with a lower efficacy. I think it still ends up in emerging markets predominantly because of the cost and because of the transportation and storage element. But I think broadly speaking, as things stand today, with the information we have today, it seems likely that the higher efficacy but higher costs and higher cost of storage and transportation vaccines skew towards DMs, and then EMs end up with lower efficacy or at least lower cost, easier to transport vaccines in the medium term.
Steph and Bob, that was a fascinating conversation. Thank you very, very much. So that's about all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to Macro Matters. We have a mailbox, macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com, and we'd love to hear from you if you have questions, topics you'd like to see covered, feedback for Steph and myself. Please get in touch, macromatters@aberdeenstandard.com. Remember, email is not a secure form of communication, so don't send us any personal information, but please do get in touch about the show. Don't forget to like or subscribe to Macro Matters on your podcast platform. But until next time, goodbye and good luck out there.
This podcast is provided for general information only and assumes a certain level of knowledge of financial markets. It is provided for information purposes only and should not be considered as an offer, investment recommendation, or solicitation to deal in any of the investments or products mentioned herein, and does not constitute investment research. The views in this podcast are those of the contributors at the time of publication and do not necessarily reflect those of Aberdeen Standard Investments. The value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up, and investors may get back less than the amount invested. Past performance is not a guide to future returns. Return projections are estimates and provide no guarantee of future results.